Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking into one of the most elusive aspects of performing live, that of inspiration during a performance. Occasionally, a performance will be going so well on stage that one not only feels supremely comfortable, but supremely confident, enough to start taking some risks. I call them risks because these experiments have the potential to fail, and unlike being in a practice room, a failure on stage is witnessed by more than just yourself. Inspiration, or the sudden feeling or impulse to do something that you were not planning on doing, can occur in these times of high stress, and I believe it is time for us to start discussing this phenomenon, along with other performance-related issues in future episodes. So, let's deconstruct inspiration on stage. Inspiration occurs when we feel comfortable. Comfort on stage usually develops along a predictable path, and though this differs from pianist to pianist, I'll put forward one which applies to many pianists I've come into contact with. One of the most difficult things about being a pianist is that we are always performing on an unfamiliar instrument in an unfamiliar acoustic setting. Because of this, we tend to focus first on gaining a comfort level with our instrument and then our hall. Consider this sonata by Scarlatti. I'll play you a bit of the opening. In many ways, this sonata is easy to start with. You can begin at any dynamic you wish, you can drop a note or two and no one will really notice, and you have the option of making a tempo error or stretch and masking it under the guise of an open style. Because this sonata is normally performed with repeats to each large section, you also have the added opportunity to play something better than the first time. And this increases the comfort level dramatically, because in your head you're thinking, well, I've done it once before without any problems, I can definitely do it again, and even better this time. This is where we get to our first type of inspirational change. The repeated note pattern is a constant. If the piano is well regulated and reliable in the action, then no matter where you play the repeated notes, you'll be able to predict how fast you can do them and at what dynamic. In terms of construction, Scarlatti prepares you in the first half for the longest stretch of repeated notes in the entire piece, which opens the second half of the sonata. How is this related to inspiration? Well, the first type of inspirational change relates to our feeling of control over the response of the instrument. In other words, the more control we believe we have over the resulting sound, the larger range we will feel confident to attempt to create in terms of dynamic, sound color, articulation, and tempo. If the piano allows us to repeat notes reliably at an average speed like this, then we feel confident to boost the speed a little if we feel that the music requires it, like this. Similarly, once we've gone through the first repeat of the second section, the second time around we can really extend the range of dynamics during the repeated note section because of our increased comfort level. is only the build-up to unpredictable inspirational choices. Imagine that you've planned your long repeated note section to start soft and gradually grow towards the bottom trill. You've practiced this thousands of times, and it's so reliable you can play it in your sleep. Now you're on stage, and you've played it successfully once before, and you're on the second repeat. You get a sudden feeling or thought of, why don't I try reversing things a little and starting the section loud instead of soft? After all, I'm in control of the instrument, and the instrument is responding, so why not push it a bit? The problem becomes evident, of course. Starting loud in this section means that the only dynamic change you can make is to get softer. And then the question becomes, are there any places that correspond to a drop in dynamics with regards to the music? Definitely not in texture, gesture, or articulation, so it must be harmony. We have this. The most appealing choice would be to drop the sound somewhere in here. This would produce something like this. Now, this is all easy when we have time to experiment and think, but what happens when we are faced with this on the fly? Well, to answer this, we have to go back a bit and consider what happens in a solid performance. There are certain elements that must be in place in order for our comfort levels to rise and allow inspiration to occur. Our technique must be predictable, comfortable, and replicable. Our memory must be rigorously tested with fail-safe points in case of anything going wrong, and our plan for each note must be practiced and fully understood. This must all be in place before we play the first note, because then we have to stop thinking about our own problems and focus on adapting our technique to the instrument, adjusting our performance to the acoustic environment, and then reading our audience and their interest levels in order to maximize the expressivity of the performance. When all of this happens, we get an ideal performance, where we feel comfortable, confident, and the music tends to play itself. It is also in these moments when we feel most comfortable to start making changes to our plan, just to see if it'll work. In the Scarlatti, we're making a change to our interpretation plan. We trust that our technique and memory are so well tested that they will not fail if something unexpected happens as a result of our change of plan. So, how do we make an experiment work like this in the moment? The change in plan occurs on the harmonic level in terms of expressivity. We're essentially saying that a section that works very well by starting soft and growing louder can also work by starting loud and then doing something after. We established that we'd start loud and get soft by this point. Now we have the other choice to make. Do we follow the same plan as before and get back into the comfort zone? Or do we continue to make changes, like doing a hard decrescendo at the end to the trill? The point is, to make a change to a plan that is well thought out, is a risk precisely because we have no time to test it to see if it works before performing it. We leave our decision-making process to instinct due to time constraints, and this often leads to an interpretation that sounds less focused or even strange given the frame of reference. The audience could ask themselves, if something worked the first time, why didn't it work the second? In order to prevent this kind of situation, you have to learn to practice for the risk. What I mean by this is that when the piece is nearing performance standard, where it's memorized, planned, and comfortable to execute, you have to start experimenting when you're playing this piece through in full, and changing a few of the parameters as you go along to see what happens. As an example, in a piece that is heavy on counterpoint, try exaggerating structural events like cadences and key changes during a playthrough. Or in a piece that is heavy on moment-by-moment expression, try emphasizing the harmony and the counterpoint, listening carefully to inner voices. This kind of distraction can lead to failure, and that's the point. During practice, the failure will inform you of things you may not have thought about before, and also show you where you may need to think or practice a little more to make sure all the bases are covered. An added benefit is that you'll notice areas where you can experiment during a live performance, and you'll also be able to look carefully at these moments and determine how to get out of a situation, if you put yourself into one on stage. Before we go any further on that front, let's consider another thread of this topic of inspirational changes. Consider the opening of Chopin's first ballade. Scarlatti before, the ideas of inspiration were on the level of being comfortable with the capabilities of the instrument and our integration with it. Another change that we make via inspiration during a performance is a change in pacing or timing. This is dependent upon how comfortable we feel with our audience and their attention. Before I discuss that, here are a few examples of the change of temporal events. The opening is marked largo, but other than that, we don't really know how slow to play it. Do we keep the music moving, like this? Or do we slow it down so that every note and inflection matters? Ultimately, what has the most communicative power? Well, they're both powerful depending on our audience. Consider that if your audience isn't paying attention to you, or if they're struggling in their seats for some action on stage, then playing this slowly will get you nowhere. The opening still has expressive power if you play it on the fast side, but it means you have to adjust the emphasis you place on certain elements in order to make it convincing. In this case, I ignored the note-by-note harmonic effects and focused on the long line and what these gestures appear to create. This also means emphasizing dynamics and long crescendi and decrescendi. Contrary to this, if our audience is loving every sound we make and swimming in the richness of our beautiful sound quality, then we can afford to take lots of time and give them what they want. This requires an emphasis on interval note changes and understanding how the harmony functions on a note-to-note level. It also means that we have to be prepared to control and change sound quality for nearly every note we play. Now, how does this relate to inspiration? When we are changing the pacing of events, we're doing so trusting that our audience will follow what we're doing and not get bored. If they're bored, then they miss connections that we're trying to make between events we're playing now and events that are coming up in the future. If we're feeling comfortable with our audience and their attention level, then moments of inspiration tend to exhibit themselves in the form of us stretching out the time at the risk of losing the audience. We might think, they're with us, therefore let's see how far we can go. Will they hang on to each note as long as we hold it? Hopefully. Now, Chopin, like Liszt, is a perfect composer to use for this kind of situation, because, quite frankly, his music relies upon the stretching of time in order to communicate effectively. Furthermore, it's not only in large sections where the inspiration to stretch time further than planned can manifest itself. This happens too in individual phrases. The main theme, if played neutrally without rubato, sounds like this. Obviously, there is something missing. But the interesting issue here is that if we add rubato in a rather traditional way, we're always forced to confront the question of how far to go. Do we do something rather conservative, like this? much more extreme, like this. Also, we have to take into account the positioning of this section in the structure of the piece. I've talked about this before in another episode, that determining expression relies upon structural and compositional knowledge, and in this short case, the melody is played near the beginning of the piece, which means that we probably should not do too much here, so that we can have a little more expression later on as the piece develops. But all of this gets thrown out the window if we feel on stage that we can risk taking more time this early in the piece because our audience is drinking up every note. It's the same problem as in the Scarlatti, but only on a different level. We're not necessarily messing around with the perception of the structure, we're changing the attention point of the audience to focus on individual events rather than a sequence of individual events. Instead of focusing on the flower, we're focusing on an individual petal. The good news here is that if our audience is with us, then they'll enjoy this added indulgence. It isn't perceived as an automatic failure, the same way that the change in dynamic plan disrupts the Scarlatti so badly. This also explains why the opening of the Chopin Ballade is so easy to play in performance. There's lots of leeway, allowing us to sacrifice precision for comfort with the instrument and audience. Inspiration on stage can lead us to change the musical text as well, though this is perhaps the rarest form that we encounter. Consider this middle section from Brahms' Intermezzo Opus 117 No. 1. Occasionally, we find moments in the music we're performing where a change in register from what is written will not damage the music in any measurable form. If the right circumstances exist, our instinct may well kick in and make a change for pure acoustic pleasure. In this last section, there is a pattern that may exist or may simply be coincidental. The first bar has the right hand move outwards, and the left moves outwards as well. hours later, this happens for the final time with the same idea. The right moves out, and the left moves out as well. Contrary motion, in other words. This is foreshadowed earlier in the section, here. Now, with this in mind, we have an interesting situation in the second bar of the second half. The right hand goes up, but the left hand, instead of going down and out, goes up as well. Given the possible pattern that occurs, doesn't it make sense to follow the contrary motion distribution and go down to the low E flat instead? From a purely selfish and instinctual aesthetic viewpoint, a modification here seems just, and it's as likely a target during a performance, especially if one is feeling comfortable and confident enough to play enjoyable distributions of chords on the piano. But this perhaps exemplifies what is necessary in order to maximize the potential of your own inspirational changes during a live performance. You have to have experimented and practiced with the structure, the harmony, and the pacing of the piece to such an extent that you are familiar with the repercussions of any changes you decide to make in the spur of the moment. If you change your dynamics or tempo, you have to have a way of creating a meaning for this outside of simple technique. If you change your pacing to affect the audience, then you have to provide this audience with an enhanced reason for listening so closely. And finally, if you change the text, it must be a change that enhances and does not detract from the music. In other words, you can follow your instinct during performance as long as the fundamentals are so ingrained in your memory of the piece that these fundamental rules and developmental paths will automatically take over when you change something. This will help to maintain the illusion of a cohesive and comprehensive interpretation, which should always be your #1 goal. So that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and don't be afraid to follow inspirational thoughts during performance. Sometimes the risk is worth it. Bye for now.